Good morning. I'm really scared now. Thanks, Chris. Where is he? I didn't know I was going to have to work for Amazon someday. This is Designing for Success with Climate Involvement. That's a bit of a mouthful, but I kind of subtitled this, Gosh, web design is getting really hard, thanks to responsive web design mainly. My name is Chris Cashdollar. I'm the VP of Design for HappyCog, and I am a 1999 graduate from Drexel University, graduated with a design degree. So at heart, I'm a graphic designer, but I've been playing in the interactive realm since the early 2000s. And at HappyCog, I've had the pleasure of working on content-heavy website redesign projects, large and small, for a vast variety of industries and clients. This includes things like higher education, consumer products, e-commerce, nonprofit, institutions large and small, online publications, and even the occasional B2B sales portal. And every project is different. Every design challenge is really unique. And what I've found to be the common thread in all my experiences is that no matter what problem you're trying to solve, the closest you can come to a silver bullet for a good project experience is really how much time and effort you put into how you communicate with your clients, what you can learn from them, and ultimately how you adapt your process. I have a secret. I really kind of hate responsive web design. Really kind of do. I had such a good thing going for a while. I could sit down, create some wireframes, site maps, crack open Photoshop, create a 1024 by whatever document. Just go to town solving problems. All that's changed. All that's changed because of responsive web design. So it's brought new demands. It's brought new deliverables, new ways of thinking. And it's forced designers like myself to have to really turn my process completely upside down. And I need to scrutinize everything as well. Do all my old ways stay, or do they go? And designers are forced to be agile. That's agile with a lowercase a. Weird joke. And we have to be amicable at looking at the entire design process and really asking hard questions. So, disclaimer, in our short time here today, we're not going to solve all the problems. I'm not going to give you every single tip and trick that's going to make all your projects and plans working with your client go really smoothly. But I'm going to kind of uncover some of the tips, tricks, techniques we use at HappyCog to kind of keep this process moving amicably forward. And you know what? We're probably more alike than you realize. You know, we've been doing responsive web design for about 4 years. But at the same time, we are learning every single day. So the problems I've had, you likely had, and we're probably going to be solving these things mostly at the same time. I do like that quote from the founder of Wired. It does make me feel a little less stressed because like we're all still here, we're still learning, we're getting better. So the first challenge, though, I find to be consistently cropping up is that the battle of design really has traditionally been fought in the trenches of artifact creation. So you know the usual suspects. You've heard a lot of them here this week. Wireframes, sitemaps, Photoshop comps, or just designing straight in the browser. We live and die by the decisions that go into these artifacts. But the wrong type of deliverable at the incorrect point in the design process, well, that can really create a point of divergence that can eat up hours and give headaches, really to even the most senior project managers. We like our project managers happy, don't we? We need to employ the right artifact that evokes our design intent at the right time. So, what is design intent? Heard a little bit of this word. Chris just talked a little bit about it. For me, design intent, when I look at it in this kind of new landscape of responsive web design, it's at the heart of putting together a responsible, purposeful process. In his December 2013 article, Jared Spool explains design as the rendering of intent, which means that a designer imagines something and then puts forth the activities to make sure that outcome is real. The sentence I like here, that last little bit, but the deliverables themselves do not produce the designs. That means that it's the people, right? We all have to understand. If we're part of this process, we all have to understand the same intention to keep everyone aligned. So the best design solution you can come up with could still be lost to the great digital void in the sky if you don't know or you can't communicate really what makes it a solid idea. That means we have to take a proactive stance on looking at how we strategically piece together a design process and how we present that effort. So your design solution is only as strong as your ability to communicate its merits. Well, how do we do this? How do we start guiding our clients through this process? I like to look at it a little differently, though. I don't like to think about it as selling design or design thinking itself. I like to change some of the phrasing we use. So instead, we're really educating. In the process of educating our clients, we gain consensus kind of step by purposeful step. Educating changes your frame of mind, especially when you're in a client services type of organization. It provides a sense of patience, allows you to drop your defenses a little bit more, and start thinking about being proactive instead of reactive. I don't like being reactive. Being in a teacher role forces you to be more prepared. And you as a designer, you should not be only defined by what you create. That's just simply outcome. Conversely, teachers are all about preparedness. They create syllabi, write lectures, create feedback loops like quizzes and tests, and they provide the right amount of coaching at the right time. And ultimately, they're creating a structure in a classroom setting that is going to establish an environment for success. So how are we creating an environment of success for our clients? And in web design and in client services in general, we kind of need to do the same thing, don't we? Switching from the traditional client-vendor relationship into this kind of educator model, we'll call it for now, needs to happen early on in the lifespan of your project. So here's the reality. You guys all know this already. Every project in the history of design has had somebody who kind of owns it, right? The key stakeholder, the client, could be your boss, could be the guy sitting or girl sitting next to you. Somebody has ownership of a project. It could be a lot of people too. You really need to get to know. As the designer on a project, it's your job to understand who's involved, who's a seat at that table, and really how their involvement ultimately will shape your effort. You might be working with multiple teams. Quite often I have to work with kind of a digital team and a marketing team on the client side. Sometimes there are multiple vendors involved. So has anyone ever had to work with like an external branding agency that's also involved in a project? We do that all the time. Or maybe even a third-party technology vendor. Quite often my designers have to work in mirrored roles. So my design director on a project might have to liaison directly with a creative director on the client side. It's tough to kind of sort out who does what, who knows what, who's responsible for what role they play in this process. But with all these stakeholders involved, we really need to make sure that language isn't going to be the thing that keeps us from getting some sort of common understanding in our design intent. We heard yesterday from Eric a little bit about this idea of language. I think he used the word progressive. Consequently, these are things that clients will say to us. And we have to know that if a client says the word progressive or clean or modern or vibrant or whatever terrible word comes out of their mouth, we have a collective understanding of what that word means. This process and kind of sussing out language reminds me of my very fleeting attempt to learn Spanish in kind of the early years of high school. My 9th grade Spanish teacher, Senora Foxall, she had it right. We need to work hard to co-define the words that come up in our design process, that define the design work we're doing together. We need to bring them up again and again and again to ensure they really take root. So, ask yourself the question, what do I need to know? And what do we need to agree upon in order to keep this project moving forward successfully? What are the phrases, concept, terms, deliverables, whatever, that might be misconstrued at some point and cause headaches and pain and hold up the process? So let's put a spotlight on potentially how we kind of do this at Happy Cog. The first thing I really like to do is I like to get a strong understanding of the design values of a project. This is tackling head-on the phrases, ideas, and concepts regarding where the design might be headed and helps us sort out the overall direction. What I like to do is I like to create some boundaries. boundaries regarding the experience, the brand, the aesthetic, pretty much anything I can get my hands on. And then draft a series of questions with a nice little Likert scale that put these values directly in the crosshairs. We do this exercise at a kickoff meeting. The format's a worksheet, and I usually might have kind of 6 to 12 of these. And so this is kind of just a representative example of what one of these questions might be. So the fun part comes in when we actually do and fill this out. So in each question, participants, they select the number that aligns to their understanding of the question. Simple enough, right? So let's pretend you and I are a team, and we're taking this worksheet. We're at a kickoff meeting with one of my clients, and your score in this, you think this is a 3. The power, obviously, comes in when you conduct this exercise with your clients themselves. So you might have a room of stakeholders involved all taking this quiz, and they answer the same questions, providing their opinion and understanding of what this value is. And goodness gracious, look at that. They think it's an 8. So a 3 and an 8, that is, we're not dealing with math here. There's not really much more math, thankfully. But that's a big difference in vision. That gap means there's a common misunderstanding between your team and their team on the design direction, at least on how it applies to this question. So, what's that mean? That means you have to talk about that. You have to bring up that idea, talk about it in a group setting, making sure that any prejudices or false information can come to the surface and you can work towards getting a consensus. A second tactic we like to use is some design benchmarking. Now, this is more about looking outward than it is inward, per se. You can use this to kind of investigate potential biases when it comes to how people talk about what's going on in the world around them. So for this exercise, I tend to gather about 12 or so examples of other websites or pieces of design that are hand-selected based on what I kind of want the client team to be gauging. So if I'm working on a higher education client, there might be 12 higher education websites. If I'm working with an e-commerce client, there might be 12 kind of best-in-class e-commerce experiences I show. And interesting enough, though, if I'm working with, say, a institution that publishes their best ideas, I might not just kind of go for the one-to-one. I might actually look at online publishing sites and see if I could find some relevant examples there. So the format, once again, this is a worksheet. I provide it to everyone at the kickoff meeting. We all participate, and I have to create a keynote to the images and stuff. And we conduct this in a group setting, and the team, and my team and the client team all participate. So what I'll do is I'll bring up a site example for about 30 seconds, and what I want is the participant give their gut level reaction to what they're seeing. Is it weak and forgettable, or is it really awesome, memorable, and compelling? The simple little Likert scale numbering provides them opportunity to give their impact and feedback. So if possible, everyone should take this quiz. And let's assume, once again, we're in this kind of fictional world again, you think that Hogwarts site's pretty great. You give it a 4. Not bad, right? But your client, wow, they're not thrilled with Hogwarts at all. They think it's pretty lousy, so they rate it a 1. Why? That simple question can spark a room full of debate that'll help you suss out, once again, some of the thinking and reasoning going on in your client's mind. So that gap is a chance to discuss why that gap exists. So what is Hogwarts doing that's invoking such a negative reaction from your client? Conversely, what is Hogwarts doing that your design team or you yourself really, really find attractive and love? But the conversation becomes more valuable if you're able to kind of aggregate the scores and look at some of this data. No more math after this, I swear. So you aggregate that data, and you look at it across teams and across kind of individual people. And for this example, let's look at column F. You might not be able to see it explicitly, but column F is, one of the examples that we all looked at. And the average score of this was 3.3, just slightly on the yay side. But that's not really telling us much. The line in red, though, that's what we want to look at. So that line in red is actually the standard deviation. Now, if my math is right in the spreadsheet, and I'm looking across all the examples, 1.40 is the highest score of standard deviation across all the sites. What's that mean? Well, that means for that client team, there actually is a lot of disagreement on the Hogwarts site. You got a lot of 1s and a lot of 5s. So right then, there's another opportunity to say, hey, wait a second. Just because you're kind of like that as an average score, there's an opportunity here to say, you're not all aligned. And I like actually calling people out and say, why don't you like this site? Language might be where we start, but at some point we need to recommend a kind of strategy, so to speak, for our design process. Many of you are likely aware of the artifact fidelity curve. Maybe not. The more fidelity, the more time it takes to kind of create the artifact itself. The lower fidelity, the more time it takes to explain the thinking itself. David Sherman talks about this in a blog post in a presentation he gave in 2011, Designer as Curator. On the low fidelity side, sketches, kind of low fidelity wireframes, they end up taking kind of a long time to explain. They don't carry as much inherent design intent, and they aren't always extremely effective. Well, conversely, higher fidelity deliverables take increasingly more and more time to create. More time explaining the design thinking, do a better job of explaining design intent, but obviously eat up a lot more of the hours. And that's where the problem comes in. In responsive web design, taking too much time to get to a decision is a risk itself. What I've found is project timelines haven't gotten longer. Budgets really aren't creeping up a lot higher since responsive web design's come to town. So that means you have to do more, be faster, smarter, better in the same amount of time. So what we need to do is we need to find the highest amount of consent with the least amount of time spent. What is the sweet spot for providing us the right amount of consent, I'll try to say that word again, without risking the hours we have to complete the project? We need to be able to move out of abstraction, another word we've heard a lot about this week, as soon as possible. There's a concept in pharmacology and some fitness circles called the minimum effective dosage. In it, pharmacologists are looking for the lowest dose level of pharmaceutical product that produces a clinically significant response in average efficacy. I am not a pharmacologist. You might not have known that. The same consideration should apply to our design process. We have to be cognizant of how much time and effort goes into each of our artifacts of design intent. If we spend too much time on the wrong artifact, the effect is the same. We waste time and budget. So I would like to consider renaming this as something else. Thinking about naming it the minimum effective artifact. And to put it back into medicine terms again, the difference between a drug and a poison is the dose. So I'm going to call them MEAs from here on out. So if I say MEA, you know that's what we're referring to. The MEA should steer us away from the common arguments in our industry about how you should design. Oh, you should be only in code, or you should be in Photoshop, or whatever. It doesn't matter. Here's the reality. Everything is just a tactic. All these design tools are just tactics. Each has its own merits and its own weaknesses. If the only tool you have in your toolbox is Photoshop, what do you think you're going to do? You're going to try to design your way and pixel push your way to a solution. Conversely, if all you know is HTML and CSS, you're going to try to build every solution. Now, it doesn't mean you can't. Neither is inherently or explicitly wrong or right. But what I like to think about is combining a mix of MEAs to really create a purposeful design purpose that's based on the realities of the situation we have. So how do we communicate our intent? What's the best way to piece together this process in respect to the idea of the MEA? Well, wireframes is a good place to start. We've seen and heard a lot about wireframes so far this week as well. And traditionally, we would make wireframes on paper using software like InDesign or OmniGraph or Illustrator. I don't really care what you use. Page after page with tons of annotations. A lot of time would be spent on these artifacts. And they'd often be very dense and complex, illuminating many, many states of UI elements, page after page after page. Essentially, you're designing an entire website experience by proxy, one state canvas page at a time. There's benefits to this, don't get me wrong. You can be very, very detailed with as much annotation as your piece of paper can allow. And it's easy to iterate. You don't like an idea, you make a new canvas, you kind of redo it, move some box and arrows around. And you know what? You don't need to be a developer to do this. You can provide this document to anyone, anywhere, ship a PDF out. PDFs, it's okay, right? Just don't tell Karen. And these people can see it, mark it up, change it, ship it back to you. And while you should be using final content for your wireframes, you don't always have to. And I think working kind of in a silo, creating wireframes makes it a lot easier to not actually work with potentially final content. So there's a little bit of an issue with this, and I'd like us to start thinking about aiming higher, especially when you think about what responsive web design brings to the table. Well, one, flexible layouts, they can't be represented unless you start drawing specific screen sizes across your document. I think, was it Brian talked a little bit about InDesign and some of the new features in InDesign if you are creating kind of flexible layouts. I don't know enough about that to comment on it, but I know definitely, there's nothing that really can be completely replicated in these applications unless you have some sort of wizard's degree, then I don't. And time is really the biggest thing. It's the thing we don't get back. So how many layouts can you ultimately make? Would that time be best spent elsewhere? Wouldn't it be better building something that actually demonstrated content, hierarchy, needs, and interaction? And one of the biggest problems, I think, with wireframes is that you start baking in all these design decisions without understanding how potentially a lot of these decisions perform. So wouldn't it be better to actually test some of these 2,568,338 different design decisions you're baking into your PDF before you put them in there? And let's be real. Responsive web design is not, and should not, and cannot be kind of considered independent of content. It's irresponsible to be designing without content at this point. Can't really say that enough. So we need to think about something that has more communicative power and pushes the design process along faster, getting us out of abstraction as early as possible. So in steps the idea of looking at something called HTML wireframes. We saw a little bit of this yesterday. Built using existing frameworks. We also use Foundation Zerb. HTML wireframes provide an opportunity to skip the paper and move into an environment, well, that is kind of a little bit more real, right? It's less of a leap of faith for those who are creating and critiquing. The medium is true. You're using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to emulate the actual experience you're designing. Now, mind you, we're not shipping these. This is not code that's going out the door. This is really just for design thinking demonstration, to demonstrate intent. Some of the positives, well, you can build responsive thinking directly into this artifact. No more kicking small screen decisions downstream. Focus on key user pathways that need to be tested. Validation is important. You have an idea or a hypothesis you want to prescribe for this solution we're designing. Well, you build it quickly and get it in front of some users to test its validity. And another positive, well, it does force you to start working with content immediately. You can't wait until later, and lorem ipsum is only going to get you in trouble. What are some of the negatives? Well, it forces you to start working with content immediately. So I hope you have a plan for that. That's a talk for another time. And if you want anything beyond just kind of the basic set of features inside these foundation or these frameworks, you're going to have to stretch your skill set a bit more. So you might have to bring in some outside help to kind of create a little bit more custom work. The key here, though, you are forced to take responsibility for your responsive thinking immediately. Putting into action aspects of your project that might have been, in the old days, easier to kind of push downstream. So with an HTML artifact of your experience, you begin to validate some of these design hypotheses, which I think it really, at this point, is really crucial. While the fidelity might be slightly lower than obviously what your final product is going to look like, you can create these wires with enough thinking and functionality to really test. Get them in front of people, find out what's not working or what is working, ensuring your intentions are successful. This ensures you're gaining insight into the solution and revising before the mistakes are more costly. Once you get into the graphic design layer, or you get into the kind of the final code, and you start to figure out then there's some errors in your user experience, no one's going to be happy about that. And guess what? Clients kind of understand this deliverable. It's much more apparent than paper. And if there's a development team in the mix, this type of artifact is going to be more demonstrative of final product, and you can spot trouble spots earlier. I had a gentleman Wednesday morning ask me a question about how do you keep scope creep from happening? Well, to be honest, an artifact like this does a really good job of kind of making sure that if it's not in here, it's not in the project scope. Now, is there a time when responsive web design artifacts Weren't the smart solution? Yes, absolutely. Real world example for you. Last year, Happy Cog wrapped up a redesign of a Spanish language newspaper based out of Puerto Rico. It was a tough project, especially early in the discovery phase. What we found out that there was kind of two teams on the client side. There was the editorial team and there was a sales team. And each of them had different goals. One team really cared about the content, while the other team really cared about the ad revenue. And what we found that was going to happen is essentially we were going to have an organizational culture war happen in the middle of our user experience documentation. Our team recognized the problem in that it informed our client that we need to change something here. We needed to really think about a new course of action early on this project. So we needed a MEA intervention. The risk of burning a ton of hours while these two teams duked it out was too risk. So our recommendation, we rolled it back. Went back to paper. We got the ad strategy right by keeping our artifacts simpler and less time-consuming. So you look at the landscape of tools you have available to you, and you look at the problem you're trying to solve, and you just don't kind of expect that you're going to roll out the same process every time. Do not be dogmatic about what you end up proposing. Now, the minimum effective artifact can be really immensely helpful also in the graphic design phase. So getting a thumbs up on approval, it's kind of a big task, right? It's an important part of what we do. And getting that approval on that aesthetic layer can be tricky and sometimes a kind of hoop jumping experience. So we need to look at what do we need to consider, what are the questions we need to ask, tactics we need to propose to get that client to give us that thumbs up knowing that they're heavily involved in this part of the process. They love this part, right? So to determine the best process and the MEA or MEAs we want to employ, let's look at the needs of the design and the people responsible for approving it and ask some questions. One, is the brand established, or is it evolving? What's the role the website plays in the brand itself? Who owns this thing? Is there a branding agency or marketing team involved? Are they responsible for maintaining it, maintaining the brand, providing some guidance to partners like you? And consequently, is there a solid digital usage guidelines available? Even if there is one, you need to scrutinize it. I've worked with these quite often, branding guidelines for the web provided by a partner you may know or an unseen partner on the client side, and you have to scrutinize these because even though they say for the web, that doesn't mean they're always best informed for the web. So be careful of those. Is the brand entirely new? Are you responsible for helping to create it? Is the work you're going to be doing in this project going to give this brand life? And if so, how do you begin to define it? And how does that affect ultimately what we need to do in our design process? And if it's in flux, how do we define the evolution? Finally, who needs to approve this thing? Who on that client side, that stakeholder, is going to be involved? Are they familiar with web conventions? Have they been involved in a web design project before? Are they more old school? They're going to want the Mad Men type big reveal. With these questions answered, we can begin to look at the tools we have available to us and create a good match. So thinking back to our artifact fidelity chart, let's think about these things and map them in this kind of quadrant view instead. So right here I got the traditional wireframes, the HTML wireframes mapped. But what I want to focus on first is this kind of lower left, this low return, low risk. And we're going to walk through some of these artifacts. So first, low on the time needed to create, but yet potentially still gaining a solid punch and helping us start the job of finding design consensus is the classic mood board. They're definitely on the lo-fi range. These things are collages that establish emotion, aesthetic style, general dynamic when it comes to an aesthetic style. When you're starting from scratch on a look and feel, something that lacks no precedent, these things can be big time savers. So this is what we're looking at here. This is an example from the omusicawards.com redesign that Happy Cog worked on last year. Every year, Viacom and MTV, they reinvent the OMAs. And we've done this 4 or 5 times with them. And every time they reinvent, that means there's a new art direction, kind of design direction we have to kind of fish out of them. We use mood boards, essentially, as a way to kind of start that conversation with their folks. So what are these things good at? Well, they help really kind of hone in on initial emotion and impression without a lot of effort. They're great for brand new brands, brand new properties, or anything that's in flux. But you need to be wary because they really only work for clients that are comfortable talking about things like feelings. This is heavy, heavy, heavy on abstraction. So the client needs to be able to talk about the merits of the aesthetic completely divorced from application, which hints to what it's poor at. There is nothing inherently web about this. It's not hinting at layout. It's not hinting at experience. It is really about look and feel. And if you don't want to get this into the wrong stakeholders' hands, really, it's just completely misunderstood. So let's jump back to our quadrant again and look at the second option here. That's kind of in the low risk, but let's move towards the higher return and see what we have available to us. Sketches. Who here doesn't sketch, right? It seems kind of obvious to include this. But again, on the lo-fi range, sketches are quick renderings of ideas completed in a way that does not attempt to really mimic any final aesthetic, kind of brand layer per se, but they're very important MEA for us. Well, why? What we find sketches to be valuable for is they can start to tackle ideas that are directly correlate to final experience, layout, and content. And they don't cost much time. But if you get in front of the right client, they can create a really large swell of consensus. So here are some sketches that HappyCog worked on with a bike retailer regarding one of their sales portals, like a B2B sales portal, where local bike dealers will come here and buy bikes and purchase their parts. The goal, really here, this was for us to audit their current experience, bring new thinking to life, and get feedback on that thinking quickly without spending a healthy portion of the project timeline on higher fidelity artifacts. We could have jumped into pixels, but it really didn't make sense. So, once again, what are they good at? Create rapidly. Do a lot of ideas quickly. They're great for gaining consensus on big concepts that would be time-consuming to create in any other manner. And they're good for projects where the aesthetic is less in play. The reality of this project, we were not touching that brand layer. We're not bringing anything new to the kind of aesthetic of this very well-documented and brand that was kind of well-established. So with that brand being locked down, our focus was on experience and how the customer was going to experience that content. What are the negatives of this? Well, it's sketch. It's kind of poor at communicating to the uninitiated. They can look amateurish. I mean, they're sketches. And might make some stakeholders higher up on the food chain a little bit uneasy. We're paying how much money for these people to do what? And they lack visual detail. You're not going to really get any sort of that art direction from this. You're not going to get any really kind of detailed content strategy. You might get the big picture, but when it comes to lines, certain content outlines, or specific style, you're not going to get that unless you're really going to spend a lot of time on your sketches. And finally, sketching multiple screens can become a hidden time suck. You don't want to just focus on desktop unless that's where everything on the project is focused. But at the same time, how many of these things are you going to sketch? Really, how many views are you going to provide? So let's think about another option. The third tactic I look at in kind of that higher return quadrant is style boards. And some people call these style tiles. Now, these are constrained snapshots of web-inspired aesthetics. It's kind of a marriage of art direction and user interface design, but isn't necessarily representative of anything specific beyond just kind of some identity components we decide. Now, these are two different style concepts HappyCog recently designed for a redesign of TEDx Philadelphia site. The format we try to keep these things the same to create some parity, use the same type of elements, the same type of content, same size to ensure that we're working kind of in a realm that makes sense. And they're really good at very specific things. Now, they do mimic web conventions. So you might hear something like, hey, that looks like a website. And it mixes graphic design decisions with potential UI patterns and real content. So things like how fonts colors, UI can combine to create a unique look and feel. These are the things we're starting to play with. And another thing I really like about these is that you can start to use real content as part of the design concept. So voice and tone can actually be part of the differentiator in these things. So you might tailor one to be a little more friendly while the other can take on a more serious tone. And of course, texture, illustration, photography, all these aspects of art design can be worked in and baked into these deliverables. I find these to be good for brands in flux. You need to investigate the core aspects of an identity, and it's not really that strong of a deliverable if the identity is kind of already well established. For many years, we've been doing work with Harvard, and I would never roll one of these out for Harvard. Red is red is red. That's never going to change. Now, one thing you should expect, that you have to have a client that has some level of comfort talking about identity and brand. Because, once again, the abstraction is slightly odd. These things can be misconstrued. Whereas before I said, hey, that kind of looks like a website, you might hear the opposite. Hey, that kind of looks like a website? Is this the homepage? We need to make sure that decisions feel slightly collaged so there really isn't a page feel to it. So it's kind of purposeful in that fact. And once again, this is poor at discerning any user experience thinking. It really only solves simple components. The snapshot can only go so far. It's not responsive. It's not a homepage. It's not a small screen. It's just a veneer that is essentially hasn't been applied to any layout or experience. So we're moving on. Let's look back at our quadrant again, and let's see what we have left. Well, we have something in the high risk but high return quadrant called comprehensive mockups, and this is kind of where I'm sure most of us are very familiar. These are full compositions, full mockups in all their pixel glory, demonstrating layout with all the necessary UI, content, brand elements, and they create the closest picture possible when it comes to a marriage of brand and limited experience. How much or how little of these you do, I think is kind of up to you. There's definitely a stigma against doing multiple concepts. I think it's up to you and your team to decide how you work with your clients to determine what you do. If you do multiple ones or you just focus on one and iterate, your call. What I'm showing essentially is a range of 3 we did for Ben & Jerry's last year. And we actually created these as the last deliverable in a string of MEAs that included HTML wireframes. We did do some style boards for them and then concluded with these kind of round of comps. And for a client like these guys, this is kind of just where we felt the work had to go towards. So why are these good, if they're good at all? They're limited abstraction. You're mimicking a full web layout. A strong experience cannot be designed from the component up. We need to understand the big picture. This is where full compositions come in. It gives us an opportunity to take on the gestalt of everything. We bring our design intent, our layout, our brand, we bring it all together. It's probably the most accurate representation we have outside of doing the actual code itself. Chris talked about new tools like Macaw that provide another opportunity to potentially play. But once again, I know HappyCog, we wouldn't ship code that comes out of Macaw, so still your level of abstraction is one level removed. And you're playing with real content. You're playing with real content in a realm that brings it to life. So you can actually start working with a copywriter, you can work on tone, you can work on length, you can start to bring a content strategy to life and see this concept takes shape. And it works for all stakeholders, especially in a distributed leadership situation. Often these guys or girls have kind of limited engagement in the project itself, but often a high level of veto power. So in a higher education situation, you're kind of working towards the point when the dean's going to see the work, right? The dean's not going to understand a style board. This is what the dean's going to want to see. Right now we're working with a consumer brand that does about $3 million, I'm going to get this number wrong. I say the number and I'm still surprised. $3 billion of revenue a year. Most of that's through the web. Their CEO, president, and founder, he's not going to understand a style board either. He's not going to understand an HTML wireframe. He's only going to kind of give his blessing when he sees something like this. So you have to work with the realities of what you're playing with. Now, The negative side of these, I think it's pretty apparent. Time consumption. How many designers can you throw at this? How many designers can you afford to throw at this? How much time do you have in your process? And how many hours are they going to take? Also, you have to pick the screens you want to focus on. So when we do these, we'll tend to do a home page and maybe a small screen view of what that looks like. Once again, every time you multiply the number of screens involved, you're multiplying the amount of time involved. And these take some time to explain interaction. The web is not a static medium. Sometimes additional states and screens you need to mock up to kind of just explain the big thinking you have. So once again, we will create kind of faux experiences, maybe cobble together a couple screens, expose a nav, something that helps sell the idea. But once again, the more you try to create in these kind of very static deliverables, the more work you're creating. So you can combine all these MEAs, but sometimes they don't tell the whole story. They don't tell the whole story of your design intent the way you're envisioning it. We know the web isn't static, and Photoshop really can't help us every time. So once you move beyond that design veneer, certain characteristics that the UI should be imbued with often need an entirely new type of MEA. Our design intent really needs to transcend beyond just the static. We need to start thinking about design over time. We need a method to demonstrate that idea to not only our clients, but also our internal teammates. Interaction has to be part of that design language. So let's go back to our quadrant and let's drop another MEA on the chart. We're looking at the animation prototype now. I'm guilty of this. I hope you're not. I've seen some people do it, and it's painful. Verbally describing interaction is just impossibly hard to stomach at this point. So the thing here, this comment slides in, and then you roll over that, and then this does that. No. You cannot do that anymore. And you cannot do that for a client. So we want to avoid this kind of pantomime effect of describing interaction and move into something that makes a little bit more sense. So what we've been finding lately is that we need to kind of start using non-traditional methods of discerning this next layer of interaction. As designers, we should be taking control of our intended interactions and not outsourcing them to, well, somebody else that's going to be taking over that work. It could be a developer, it could be no one. For example, this is a recent animation prototype that we created internally at HappyCog just to make sure that the designer and the developer were on the same page. I sat in a meeting with them one time, and the designer was like, we wanted this to happen. And the developer just kind of gave her a stare. I had no idea what she was talking about. We hit pause. We said, you know what? Let's work on some sort of proof of concept internally, quick, just to make sure all of us are in agreement about the intended interaction of the site. If you don't do it now, and mistakes are made much later in the process, you're not going to have time to remedy those. The amount of time left in a project when you're in the final build is much less, and it's a lot more scrutinized. And things like, how an interaction comes together might be left off the table. But animation prototyping doesn't need to be the entire site, like the previous example. We can actually start looking at very distinct elements and say, how do we use interaction to kind of imbue more brand awesomeness into the experience? So there's this site by this company that make games, and we might have had something to do with it a few years ago. And one of the core aspects of it was bringing some nostalgia into the interface itself. So we invented this idea of kind of once you hovered over the products, you got this kind of little coin flip that some of you might remember from a certain game. It gave the right level of nostalgia, but it also provided a great feedback loop for the user. So it was kind of the perfect mix of brand, animation, interaction, and helpfulness. You might not be thinking yet of design through time, but look around you. There are numerous applications that exist that have interactive capabilities you might have not thought about traditionally. You might have a few on your laptop or your devices right now. Baltimore-based agency FastSpot, they understand this. In June, they published an article on their blog detailing the design animation prototypes they created for a client to detail how they envision the interaction of a site. If you look at that article, there's a good quote in here that I pulled out, and I like the last bit here. The most important part that I like to focus on, the quality time is spent on the design itself and not on the creation of the prototype. That means the designer was able to communicate their intent purposefully without having to spend a lot of time or learn new techniques just to kind of make this thing come to life. Our goal should be the same. Here's an example of kind of one of the little video demos they did. We should be spending just enough time demonstrating the interaction intentions, but not actually have to build it in final code. So once again, look around you. Consider some of the applications you have access to that might be able to do this in. You might be surprised. Here, they were using After Effects, but have you ever thought about using Keynote? There's a new Adobe product, I think it's Adobe Edge Animate, which is rather easy to use, or maybe even good old Flash. If you're just using it for design intent, does it really matter? Find the program that works for you. It might be something you're familiar with already. Maybe Flash is not dead after all. So now that we understand the pieces of the design process, it's time to turn your attention towards how you manage client feedback. Looking at the educational model instead of just feeling like our design work is being judged, I like to think of design presentation feedback opportunities as test-like scenarios for clients. So you provide the guide rails, you provide the coaching. When I present design, I make sure that I have these type of questions queued up and ready to go. Things like, does this design appropriately bring to life the brand attributes described in the strategy? Or does this user flow allow students to easily register for classes? Or does this design evoke the actual design value discussion that we agreed upon in the design phase or the early discovery phase? If you don't focus on how you want the feedback back from your client, you're going to be in trouble. We have to make sure that you put a concerted effort into ensuring that what you get back from them is helpful too. If you don't, you will get the feedback you deserve, and it will create more additional loops of wasted time and frustrated designers. So, if everything goes wrong, it never does though, right? What do? Not sure? That's okay. Everything we talked about today is about being proactive. It's about strengthening the base of the relationship with your clients and pulling you more into the process and letting you be less reactive. If you have to be in a reactive scenario, the best bet is to be as forthright as possible. There's another quote from David Sherwin I pulled from his book, Success by Design. You should initiate a direct conversation with your client as soon as possible. Tackle discrepancies head on. If you sit on anything that might be construed as counter to agreed upon direction, you're setting the tone that strategy and consensus isn't important. So get on the phone and talk. Do not use email. Email is an incredibly ineffective way to debate a point. Don't shy away from the hard conversations. At Happy Cog, we try to create dedicated project sites that track everything, compile everything. It keeps everything together in one place, our design artifacts, our project plan, as well as our Basecamp account. Why do we do this? Well, we want to avoid the big reveal. We heard Eric talk about this yesterday as well. Every detail we have in the project, every deliverable, every round of revisions, every checkpoint is captured here. It's referenceable. It's the history of the project. It creates that timeline of what you've been working on. But since we don't run away from design, we want to make sure our clients involved in every checkpoint along the way. We have to look at this kind of new design challenge that's in front of us all. This idea of design system thinking. We need to break up our large design problems into smaller ones. Charles Eames kind of understands this. He understands constraints. When you think about design system thinking, you might think about as, gosh, this sounds really confining. That's not the case. Design really only happens when constraints are essentially embraced. And on the web, despite all the advances, we're still dealing with constraints, many different types of real boundaries. Technology, browsers, or even just kind of the constraints imposed by our clients. It may sound counterintuitive, but a design system can set you free. A system doesn't need to be boring. Consider this redesign of Harvard Business School that Happy Cog assisted with. The entire web aesthetic is comprised of reusable components that need to be determined, but then provide some level of governance to the actual usage of the site itself. So first, we established the base pages, right? We established the core user experience interactions. Yes, we're designing the site, but we're also designing the long-term instructions for using the components of the site design. And a smart and powerful system doesn't come without instructions. Web designers who are reveling in the constraints know the power of a system comes with successful governance. If a site can't be maintained, it's essentially dead on arrival. And that's why it's important to create enough documentation so that the system can be used appropriately long after the design thinking has been wrapped up. What we're looking at here is essentially the manifestation of the design system thinking we provided to the Harvard Business School so that, once again, the thinking can live on. Our web-specific document, this addition to their style guide, helps future designers and developers understand the reusable structures of the design system, ultimately helping them understand the choices we've made, our design intent, their purpose, and ultimately inform future expansion and adaptation. A graduate level test for this, and test for design teams that want to get more into this thinking, I would check out this site, patternlab.io. It's a great actualization of design system thinking broken down into how you can use it in your projects. While it empowers your design and development teams to think about these styles as endlessly recombinable elements, we aren't used to the idea of letting kind of go a little bit as designers, right? We kind of like control. The word system, thus, probably needs to be introduced in your design thinking lexicon very early in that process. But you know what? Education, again, a functional design system is really about helping the project owner, your client, understand the benefits of extensibility while letting them know that our attention has been where it needed to be. There will always be complex user experience problems to solve, and you need to recognize that where a large percentage of your time should be. Now, there's always a wide swath of pages or page clones of similar purpose. These workhorse pages shouldn't be chores to create. Just because they exist doesn't mean you have to spend your time on them. System thinking can reduce that amount of time dedicated to these high-volume, single-purpose pages. And those Lego-like atomic elements, well, they can provide the blueprints for how they're created. So look at your design problem. Look at what each tool is strong at. Consider your stakeholders, your time constraints, and the communication challenges you have in front of you. Piece together your tactics. Do not be dogmatic going headfirst into your process. You want to get out of abstraction, and you want to get approvals. You want to get into code as responsibly early as possible. That frees you up to tackle the really hard things. The really hard things that ultimately will have a pronounced effect on the business goals of your client. So meanwhile, you're establishing a blueprint that for how this site is going to be managed and maintained long term. It's a balance, right? It's a balance that helps make all the members of your team happy and your client team happy. And essentially, what you're hoping is everything really can be awesome. Thank you.